Hello and welcome, everybody. We just have a couple minutes, about 3-4 minutes before we're going to get started. So hopefully everybody can hear me okay. We're just waiting for some more people to join. So sit tight and just give me a second. All right, for anyone who's just joining, we're just waiting for a couple more people to join. We're still a couple of minutes to 7. So sit tight and the webinar will be starting soon, okay? Hi everyone, welcome. So again, we're gonna be starting about 1 minute or so. So we're just waiting for a couple more. I see there's a lot of people still coming in and joining. Hi everyone, so for those that are just joining us, welcome. Again, it's just before 7, so I see there's still a lot of people signing in, so we're gonna get everyone a chance to get settled before we start. Okay, so it's 7 o'clock right now. So we'll get started. So thank you guys for joining us on this mild Wednesday night. It's always nice when people can kind of join us from the comfort of their own living room to learn a little bit about a really, really cool topic that we're super, super excited about, so the microbiome. So the speaker tonight is Dr. Adam Livingston. So he's a clinical pharmacist. So he got his Doctor of Pharmacy from the University of Toronto. He's also completed extra training through the Gut Institute and done several courses on actual microbiome health and how to actually kind of grow a microbiome and a lot of the information that you're getting tonight. At Nutrichem, so he does work at Nutrichem. He's in the dispensary, but he's also a clinical pharmacist, and he's kind of the head of our deprescribing program. So he works a lot with deprescribing and kind of helping people get off their proton pump inhibitors and that sort of thing. So that's his background. His passion is a lot more in gut health, though, and as you'll see tonight with a lot of the information he's going to present to you. So a couple little housekeeping things. This webinar is being recorded, so don't worry about having to kind of write anything down. If there's any extra little tidbits, you will be getting a copy of, you will be getting the recording sent to you through email. So you don't need to worry about that. You guys, you can type questions into the little question box and we're gonna go through them all at the end. So don't think your questions won't be answered. We are gonna go through them, but we usually like to save it to the end because sometimes what people ask might actually be covered in the topic of the lecture itself. And if you have any questions about kind of what to do, we're going to cover that at the end too, about how to actually go about kind of putting everything that you've learned into play. Okay, so without further ado, here is Adam Livingston, our clinical pharmacist. So enjoy the webinar, and excited to hear what you guys think.
All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining me. I am Adam Livingston, PharmD. I'm one of the clinical pharmacists with Nutrichem Compounding Pharmacy and Clinic. And tonight I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about mapping your microbiome. So just a bit about myself. Emma gave me a great introduction, but my background is in biochemistry. So I've always been kind of a chemistry guy, a chemistry nerd. And I am a licensed pharmacist, and I stayed in school forever and finished my Doctor of Pharmacy from U of T. And then I've been doing a lot of training on microbiome stuff because it's an area I'm passionate about and I find really fascinating. And I hope all of you joining me find it fascinating as well. And then I joined the Nutrichem team. And if some of you don't know, we're a team of clinical pharmacists, NDs, naturopathic doctors, and registered holistic nutritionists. And we try to come up with personalized health solutions for our patients. And that's me in the back there. So how did I get interested in the microbiome? It might seem a little weird. You have a pharmacist, a drug expert interested in something that's seen as a little bit more natural, the microbiome. But as a pharmacist, the more and more you work with drugs, especially in chronic conditions. So when you're dealing with acute conditions or emergencies, drugs can be miracle molecules, right? If you're in an emergency room or if you're going to an emergency room or you are about to have surgery, any kind of acute issue, drugs can be amazing. But in a lot of chronic conditions, the evidence, actually the research isn't that good. And in clinical practice, you deal with a lot of people that don't necessarily get a lot better taking drugs for their whole life to correct symptoms. And so you have to start looking at root cause. And as Emma mentioned when she introduced me, I am heading up the deprescribing program at Nutrichem. And most of what we're focusing on are proton pump inhibitors, which are acid suppressing drugs. And as you start to learn about people coming off of these drugs, you kind of have to learn about how to improve people's gastrointestinal health. And it's impossible to avoid learning about the microbiome. There's so much research coming out about it right now. You can't really avoid it as the root cause of a lot of people's issues. Now, it's really naturopathic doctors and registered holistic nutritionists that kind of own the microbiome right now. They're the ones that really do a lot of things with diet, with fibers, with probiotics. They're sort of the diet experts. My approach, because of my chemistry background, is a little bit more biochemical and microbiological. So I'm kind of a nitty-gritty, nuts and bolts chemistry guy, but I think that my perspective on this can actually be pretty interesting and effective. So I'll just give you a brief outline of the presentation. I'll probably talk for about 45 minutes, and then I'll open it up for questions. So I'll give you just some microbiome basics, and we'll actually define the microbiome. I'll outline some of the key microorganism groups in the microbiome, those that we want to grow and those that we want to avoid growing. And we've been working hard on a Nutrichem microbiome map, which is basically kind of organizing all this research that's coming out on the microbiome. Then I'll outline the evidence and give you all some information for microbiome treatments in several conditions. So I'll show you all, just run through quickly just to show you the breadth of evidence on probiotics. Prebiotics has less clinical evidence right now, but it's what really gets us the lasting effects. Those fibers are really what anchor in our probiotics. I'll talk to you about prebiotics. I'll touch a little bit on diet and exercise and stress management as well, which have research behind them showing some effectiveness on the gut health as well. And then I'm not going to push too many products on you guys or anything, but I will mention a couple of the really cool, unique products Nutrichem has for treating the microbiome. And then I'll also talk to you a bit about some of the services we can provide for treating the microbiome and how you can map your own microbiome. So it was over 2,000 years ago that Hippocrates, the Greek philosopher and the father of Western medicine, stated that all disease begins in the gut. He also said that you should let food be thy medicine and medicine thy food. So it's really interesting that today, millennia after Hippocrates died, we're kind of getting this resurgence or this resurfacing of this ancient wisdom. And we're seeing sort of a return to these principles of treating the microbiome as being really important in health. So something we bat around a lot at Nutrichem is this idea that we're trying to basically flip our healthcare treatment pyramid. So right now, a lot of our healthcare systems, you'll see down at the bottom there, it's based off of drugs as sort of the foundation of what we use. Now, when you look at drug guidelines, like even as a pharmacist, when I look up drugs in the different drug guidelines for how to treat people, a lot of the guidelines will even say that you should use lifestyle and diet, so basically the microbiome, before using drugs. But I think pharmacists and a lot of doctors and different clinicians are actually kind of guilty of sort of skipping over diet and lifestyle and going right to drugs. And we hear a lot about the opioid crisis right now, but there's actually sort of a prescription drug crisis. And we're actually the #2 users per capita of prescription drugs in the world, behind only the United States, because we have this system that's very drug-based, which is not necessarily the most cost-effective way of treating people. So what we're trying to do at Nutrichem is sort of flip this healthcare pyramid. So it looks a little bit more like this. Basically, the foundation would be, treating people's microbiome via the, diet, prebiotics, probiotics, and then dealing with nutrient status, balancing hormones. And then if there's still issues, then we can use drugs. I'm a pharmacist, I'm not against drugs, but I am against the overuse of drugs. And with a lot of people, if we're gonna go to the root cause, we have to start looking at microbiome. So microbiome here would really be the foundation of our new healthcare pyramid. And I think things are starting to shift this way. So when I think about the microbiome, an analogy I really like is that the microbiome is kind of like this micro rainforest, this tiny little ecosystem inside of you. So when we look at a rainforest, there are certain key groups of, if we look at just plants, for example, certain key groups of diverse plants that you need for a healthy rainforest. So you'd have certain types of trees, certain types of shrubs, certain types of grasses. Same thing in the microbiome. So you have certain key groups of bacteria that we know are required for a healthy microbiome, just like a rainforest. So, and I'll actually get into some of these bacterial groups and how they're really important for helping your microbiome survive and thrive. So that's an analogy we really like. So what is the microbiome? So your body actually has multiple microbiomes. You have a microbiome on your skin, and in different areas of your skin, you have different microbiomes. Different microorganisms like to live in different areas all over you. You have a different microbiome in your belly button than you do in your armpit. You have a different microbiome, so you'd see different microbes in your mouth, for example. And when we talk about the quote microbiome, we typically are referring to the large intestine, which is sort of like the headquarters of the microbiome for your whole body. That's where you get by far the densest concentration of bacteria. So it's really this complex microecosystem of bacteria, fungi, phages, which are just viruses, and parasites in a lot of cases. in the large intestine. And there's estimates that the amount of bacteria from your stomach to your large intestine actually typically weighs about 2 to 5 pounds, which is interesting because that's actually about the same weight as the human brain. And they're often talking about the microbiome as the second brain right now, which makes a lot of sense. Similar weight, and it's also responsible for the production of the majority of your neurotransmitters. 90% of your body's serotonin basically has to be made by bacteria in the gut, for example. So the microbiome in the large intestine is really sort of this new emerging organ that's involved in inflammation and inflammatory conditions, immunity and autoimmune conditions, allergies, food sensitivities, gastrointestinal conditions, anxiety, depression, addiction, diabetes, and obesity. It's really interesting because in the microbiome, there's actually more bacterial cells than human cells, which sounds insane, but they're very small cells by volume. And and there's actually more bacterial cells than human cells. Some estimates that there's about 10 times the number. So it's very interesting. Sometimes I wonder if, we're growing the bacteria or the bacteria kind of growing us. It's a bit of a sci-fi way of thinking, but I do wonder sometimes if we're kind of just hosts for the bacterial overlords. And what microbiome mapping basically is just a term we use a lot at Nutrichem, of basically taking all this research. So we have crazy amounts of research coming out on the microbiome right now. It's a really hot area in health research. So mapping is basically all these different groups, people like us at Nutrichem, there's people like the Gut Institute, for example, in the US, people all over, functional medicine practitioners. Everyone's kind of scrambling to organize all of this data that's coming out and figure out, okay, what if we have all these bacteria and we know they're important, which bacteria do we actually know are good? It's more complex than this, but what are kind of the good and bad bacterial groups, which we want to grow, for example, the good ones, and what do we use to grow them? What fibers can we grow them with to improve people's health? So why are we focusing so much on the microbiome? Like I said, we have all these conditions we're not good at treating. And I think we really live in an era when our microbiomes are kind of under assault all the time. We really overuse antibiotics by prescription. Any pharmacist working in common pharmacy sees lots of antibiotics come through. We tend to overuse them in things like cough and cold and flu when they may not be necessary. It's sort of, quote, just in case prescribing. Sometimes in children, we see them a little bit overused in things like ear infections that might be self-limiting. Of course, we don't want to deny children antibiotics for serious infections where they actually have a bacterial infection. But for example, sometimes it's a viral infection, or there's a watch and wait technique that we should be using, and we really overuse antibiotics. And we also have a lot of antibiotics in our livestock, in our meat, for example. We use it to increase meat yields in farming. So we're exposed to a lot of antibiotics. We also are exposed to proton pump inhibitors. We use them for a lot of common gastrointestinal issues. They're very strong acid suppressors, and we use them for things even like mild heartburn, which is kind of overkill in a lot of cases when there's a lot of other options. And those drugs now, proton pump inhibitors, we know they have a lot of long-term safety issues, and we do see a lot of people on them for just decades. Our diets now, especially in North America, we know we eat a lot more refined sugars and carbohydrates than we probably should, and very minimal fiber, and very high meat and fat. So our fiber intake is very low. 90% of Canadians don't really meet the daily requirements set out by Health Canada for fiber intake. Whereas when you look in some populations in rural communities in other parts of the world, they can get up to 100 grams of fiber. So they eat fiber all day. Most of their diet is fibrous plant-based diet. We also know there's environmental toxicities that we don't totally know what we're doing to our microbiome and to the what we're doing toxically to our body. We have exposure to plastics, exposure to heavy metals. We don't really know what the long-term side effects are. And there's also the idea that maybe we're too hygienic, in the hygiene hypothesis. Maybe we sanitize too much. We're using too much Purell or too much too many antiseptics on things because we're obsessed with cleanliness, when actually a little bit of exposure to some germs can be good. There have been studies in children where children exposed to more dirt or having a pet when they're young exposes their microbiome to more germs, but they actually end up being healthier, having less allergic diseases, lower rates of asthma, lower rates of eczema as they age. So maybe we're a little too clean for our own good, and we should let ourselves get a little bit dirtier. It might be good for our immune systems and our microbiomes. And we also have higher rates now than probably ever before for C-section birth versus vaginal birth. So vaginal birth is really important for passing the mother's microflora to the baby, for setting them up for the rest of their life for a healthy microbiome. We do a lot more C-sections now to avoid risk in birthing. And of course, there are lots of instances when a C-section is the way to go and it's important, but that is definitely a factor in why our microbiomes, why are our guts so messed up right now. And I just wanted to add this in there. Earlier this month, there was actually a huge study in the Journal of American Medical Association, JAMA. April 2nd, this just came out, and it's the association between use of acid suppressing medications and antibiotics early in childhood, basically related to allergic diseases. So we know that if we mess with our microbiome, because that's what these drugs do, if we mess with our microbiome when children are very young, it sets them up for a disrupted microbiome later in life. So this is what we're doing. So as more and more research comes out, we're trying to organize it and structure it in a way. And I'll show you different ways we're structuring it, because no one totally has it pinned down right now, but a lot of different groups are kind of moving in the right direction. We're trying to map this out. And I'll show you our own microbiome map at NutriChem. So one way people map is they actually kind of do it anatomically. So they move from the stomach through the small intestine down into the large intestine, and they look at these large bacterial groups that you see as you move. So if we start in the stomach, it kind of goes from lowest concentration to highest concentration. So stomach actually has very low concentration of bacteria, for example. And you'll see, bacteria like, bacteria like, for example, lactobacillus and H. pylori. As you move into the small intestine, you'll see a lot of streptococcus and lactobacilli. Those are, what you would normally find in a healthy microbiome. And then as you move towards the sort of later distal portion of the small intestine, it starts to look a little bit more like the large intestine. So you start to get more and more concentration of bacteria and more variety of bacteria. And you can see it there in the distal ileum. And then you move into the large intestine, aka the colon. And this is the real headquarters, the hive of activity of bacteria in your body. Very, very highly concentrated bacteria in there. Okay, here. Oh, there we go. Another way of mapping it that's not anatomical, and this is based on research, is we can look at good versus bad microbes in the large intestine, in the colon. And it's an oversimplification just to say good versus bad. So in the column on the left, these are our, quote, good bacteria. These are the bacteria that in many different studies, these are the bacterial groups where you start to find, okay, if we increase those bacterial groups and then the subspecies listed underneath, so you see actinobacteria, that's a big phyla of bacteria, and then bifidobacterium is what's called a genus, and then there's many different subspecies under that. So these are huge groups of bacteria on the left. But we know through various studies that have come out, if we can increase those, they're associated with health benefits. And then you have the bacteria on the right, which, again, it's an oversimplification, but these would be bad bacteria. And if you look at the names there, they're typically the bacteria that you'd associate with like a pathogenic infection, right? When you get infected, you can get a staph infection, a strep infection. And those bacteria like to hang out on your body. They are normal parts of certain microbiomes on your body. But if they overgrow and they over-inhabit parts of your large intestine, then they can be associated with a lot of health problems. So it's these ones on the left here. These are the groups of bacteria that we've begun to map, and a lot more research is coming out on these. And I call them the ABCs. It's kind of the big groups, the actinobacteria, Akkermansia, certain species of Bacteroides, and then the Clostridia clusters. So these are the groups of bacteria that in various studies, if you feed them properly with the right fibers, if those increase in people's large intestine, if you take a stool sample, they're associated with a lot of health benefits. So then, if we take those good bacteria from all the research, that's what we call the keystone bacteria. There are key bacteria. We isolate all of them. So this is the beginning of our map. Okay, we know what bacteria we want to grow. These are the ones that are associated with a healthy microbiome. This is what we want to grow in people. These are basically, if we think of these as probiotic bacteria, we have to grow them with prebiotic bacteria or fibers. So for example, actinobacteria bifidobacterium really likes a type of fiber called oligosaccharide. So we can use oligosaccharides to grow more bifidobacterium in your gut. Akkermansia really likes these different fibers called polyphenols. It likes tannins, and it also likes oligosaccharides, but polyphenols are one of its favorites. That's why I listed it first there. So you see how we start to map, okay, here's the good bacteria we want to grow. What do they like to eat? And in this way, we can start to map out how to treat someone's gut and how to increase the levels of all these healthy bacteria. Bacteroides likes inulin. A really interesting species on Bacteroides is listed here, the second one, A. putridinus. And that's an interesting one because there are studies where if you take a vegan or vegetarian and you introduce meat back into their diet, you will see A. putridinus actually increase. And it's actually considered a healthy bacteria that has health benefits, which kind of shows some sort of evolutionary evidence that some of these bacteria that are associated with good health that we co-evolved with, it shows that there was at least, there was definitely some meat in our ancestors' diet. And based on all these bacteria, it looks like our ancestors' diet, getting all these fibers and a little bit of meat, they probably ate a plant-based diet and small amounts of meat, because there are some probiotic bacteria in your gut that actually like the saturated fat that comes from meat. But for the most part, they like plant fibers. Clostridia clusters, they really like certain types of fibers called pectins and polyphenols. And that's Clostridia cluster 4, and Clostridia cluster 14A really likes some of the other oligosaccharides. So don't worry about the terminology for now. I'll go through some of these later. Just know that we have these, as more and more research comes out, we have these keystone bacteria that more and more people are knowing about. And if you can grow them with these fibers, you get improved gut health. So that's why we map, because it gives us an idea of how, instead of just picking a fiber off the shelf, it's like, well, no, we want to pick fibers that grow specifically these bacteria that are associated with all these health benefits by feeding them in the large intestine. So just to summarize, remember your ABCs, which is these groups of bacteria: Akkermansia, Bifidobacterium, Bacteroides, and the Clostridia clusters. So before I get too far into going over some of the probiotic stuff and all the research, because there's tons of research now on probiotics that I would just like to show you. I won't go into detail. Oh, shoot. There we go. I do always love looking at comparative population studies. And this is where I actually started when I started looking at the microbiome. I started, saying, North Americans, we always talk about our diet and our unhealthy diet, but are there studies taking basically stool samples from our rural population versus sort of a more industrialized North American-like population? And there's quite a few of them. This was one published in 2010, and it's the impact of diet in shaping gut microbiota in 2 different populations. And what they did was they took children from urban Italy to represent sort of their urban industrialized population, and they took children from they took children from Burkina Faso in Africa to represent their rural population, and they basically took stool samples. And when we look at their stool samples of the bacterial strains that they found, so these at the bottom here, Escherichia, that's E. coli, Salmonella, Shigella, and Klebsiella, those are basically bad bacteria. So if you look at the EU children, that's the Italian children that live in an urban environment, they kind of represent almost like a North American or urban industrialized diet exposed to certain antibiotics. They have way higher levels of some of these basically bad pathogenic bacteria. When you look at the children from Burkina Faso that ate more a traditional diet, very high in fiber, very little exposure to antibiotics, you see way lower basically bad bacteria. So the children from Burkina Faso had far healthier guts. And this also showed up in what are called short chain fatty acids. So big long word, but basically it just is a marker of good bacteria. Good bacteria make short chain fatty acids. Short chain fatty acids are good for you. So when you look at the children from Burkina Faso, the more rural children, their levels of short chain fatty acids completely blew the Italian children's levels out of the water. Way better, way healthier guts based on their short chain fatty acids. And the Italian urban children had much less short chain fatty acids. So we know that if you grow up in an urban environment, your gut is essentially less healthy than people that grow up in rural environments. And you see this all over the world. As you look at more and more comparative population studies, comparing basically industrial populations to rural populations, you start to see that there's these zones all over the planet where people have healthier microbiomes and basically live longer and are healthier in general. And these are what a lot of researchers call the blue zones on planet Earth. So these were the top 5. Number 1 is Sardinia, Italy. 2 was Okinawa, Japan. And there was Nicoya Peninsula in Costa Rica. There's 2 Greek islands, Icaria and Crete. And there's actually a Seventh-day Adventist community, so they live almost like the Amish, in Loma Linda, California. So a very agricultural community. So in these blue zones, they have the most centenarians of anywhere in the world, so the most people that make it to age 100 or higher. They have some of the lowest rates of chronic illnesses, so conditions like diabetes or obesity, certain cancers, certain mental illnesses, a lot of food sensitivities basically don't exist. And what's interesting is these places are not only geographically isolated, they're nutritionally remote as well. They're sort of isolated from an industrialized diet. They eat pretty much all of them eat a plant-based or Mediterranean-style diet. And when they look at stool samples from these people, they have some of the most diverse microbiomes, and they all have those A, B, C groups of bacteria in high levels than other places in the world. So very interesting. So in Western medicine, we have kind of what we refer to at NutriChem sometimes as sort of the microbiome black hole. So we have all these conditions that we try to treat symptomatically with drugs that don't work all that well. So in certain inflammatory conditions, autoimmune conditions, allergies or sensitivities, mental health issues. We have kind of a mental health and addiction epidemic, certain types of cancers, gastrointestinal conditions, some types of chronic infections like urinary tract infections. And we also have another epidemic of diabetes and obesity as well. And we're starting to realize that it might be the microbiome that is sort of the underlying root cause of a lot of these conditions, and we can treat as much as we want symptomatically with drugs, but it's only scratching the surface. You're not getting at the root cause. It's like taking the batteries out of your fire alarm without actually putting out the fire. Drugs can be useful for that, but eventually you got to get at that root cause. And in a lot of these conditions, there's more and more evidence pointing at the microbiome. So some of the evidence out there for probiotics. So I still get in arguments sometimes with other pharmacists or doctors a little bit, but basically there isn't evidence for probiotics. So I love stacking studies because there's a lot of studies on probiotics, and I don't even think it's the most effective way to treat the microbiome. I think fibers are the better way to anchor in good bacteria and get the lasting effects. But probiotics are still useful and effective, and there's piles of studies on them now. They have the most research because they've kind of been around longer, but now there's more and more research on fiber coming out. So we're in the midst of a microbiome research explosion. If you looked in 2003, you could find maybe 18 studies if you looked in some medical journals. By 2015, there's over 26,000 studies, and now we're up to, I think, over 100,000 studies. I don't have the exact figures, but there's estimates that they're cranking out, researchers are cranking out up to 7,000 studies or more a month on the microbiome. So we're just trying to keep up and just get the key bacterial groups to kind of help map this out and help patients with their microbiomes. So, which brings me to probiotics. This is sort of the stack of studies I like to give to other healthcare providers, but I realize this is a little bit more for the public, so I won't go into too much detail on these studies, but I'd just like to show you some of these big studies, what are called meta-analyses, where they stack a whole bunch of studies together and then statistically analyze it and say overall whether something's effective and safe. And I'll do this with probiotics in just a moment. We'll just introduce probiotics if you're not aware of what they are. They're basically just healthy bacteria that can confer health benefits. Sources, a lot of times we can use a supplement, but fermented foods like sauerkraut, kimchi, or kefir are really good. Yogurt contains some probiotics, specifically lactobacillus. The doses are really low in yogurt, so I think a lot of it's marketing as a really I don't know how effective they really are, just in terms of probiotics, because they're so low dose. Most supplements you buy will have lactobacillus and bifidobacterium strains will be the most common you'll see. And then S. boulardii, Saccharomyces boulardii, is a really good one for acute GI problems. It's the one I use a lot when patients are starting on an antibiotic. And then there's a few other novel probiotic supplements out there that don't have those strains. There's an E. coli-based probiotic in Europe. There's some other probiotics that contain some interesting strains of like staph, for example, which is VSL number 3. Staphylococcus thermophilus is an interesting one. But for the most part, you'll see lactobacillus and bifido and S. boulardii in supplements. It's important to note that when I showed you those bacteria before, 70 in the good versus bad table in sort of our NutriChem map, 75% of the beneficial bacteria in the large intestine cannot be given in a capsule, in a probiotic, because they're too sensitive to oxygen. So a lot of the really good beneficial bacteria in the gut, in the large intestine, are what are called obligate anaerobes. So even a little bit of exposure to oxygen kills them pretty quickly. Your large intestine is like a closed system that doesn't actually get a ton of oxygen in there. It's a pretty low oxygen environment. So we can't just throw these healthy bacteria into your large intestine. You have to grow this 75% of healthy bacteria with fibers, with prebiotics. So just to show you all the evidence in GI of probiotics, just to show you how much is out there now. So it's pretty much undeniable that probiotics are useful. GI conditions. So GI conditions, for example, antibiotic-associated diarrhea. There is piles of evidence for probiotics. Pretty much anyone coming through NutriChem starting on an antibiotic, we get them going on a probiotic almost immediately. So probiotics are great for antibiotic-associated diarrhea and just diarrhea in general in a lot of cases. And in particular, I really like S. boulardii. Inflammatory bowel disease, probiotics have a lot of evidence that can be really useful. In particular, a probiotic that I mentioned called VSL number 3. It's a very high dose probiotic, really useful in ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease. Literally, efficacy very similar to even a drug without the side effects, without the safety issues. Irritable bowel syndrome, probiotics are useful. I'm not going to spend too much time on these. Again, these are large studies essentially proving that these work in the realm of a drug without a lot of the side effects. Inflammatory skin conditions. So probiotics have some really good evidence for being used during pregnancy or in early infancy with a lot of children for helping to prevent atopic dermatitis, eczema. I know some of our pregnant patients coming through NutriChem do use certain probiotics for preventing some of these inflammatory conditions or autoimmune conditions in children. And we also have some children with eczema that have found probiotics really useful as well. Acne. Acne is one where probiotics have some very good evidence, and there's even now this emerging relationship between the gut, brain, and skin. And this was the literature review from a few years ago that's really interesting. And acne, probiotics can be really effective for acne as well, especially high-dose combinations of lactobacillus and bifidobacterium. I like it in the 50 billion unit. Mental health conditions. So we know that there's now this gut-brain connection emerging, and we call the microbiome our second brain. So there's all these studies where they've used it in depression as well as anxiety. They've used probiotics, and probiotics show some efficacy and safety for anxiety and depression as well. So these can be very useful adjunctive therapies to patients even on antidepressants. We have billion-dollar industry of drugs trying to target serotonin to help with people's mood when they have anxiety and depression. Well, if you're ignoring the gut, when we've already discussed, the gut makes 90% of your serotonin. How are we not looking at the gut or probiotic, right? If the gut's making all your serotonin and the model of a disease like depression is that you're depleted in serotonin, or you have low serotonin at the synapse in your brain, how can you ignore something like the microbiome where all of your serotonin is made? So probiotics can be useful for anxiety and depression. And it's actually interesting right now, speaking of mapping, there is huge studies going on in rats and mice on gut-brain mapping. And this is kind of looking at your gut as the second brain. And what they're basically doing, to simplify all of this, they have these massive charts that you can find in some of these medical journals where they're doing all these rat and mice studies, where they're basically using different probiotics in what are called, in some of them being like germ-free mice, for example, so mice that have no microbiome, and then they give it basically a good or bad bacteria and watch the results on their behavior and what neurotransmitters they make. And through studies like this, they basically find out things like, oh, okay, if we give a mouse, let's say a mouse that it basically doesn't have anything in its large intestine, nothing in its microbiome, blank slate, and we give it, for example, Bifidobacterium longum, you can watch its serotonin levels go up. And that's how you kind of control for all these confounding factors. And you can give different probiotic bacteria and watch how it changes their neurotransmitter levels. And in this way, they can say, oh, okay, Bifidobacterium longum, for example, that species of Bifidobacteria, it's really good at making serotonin. Then they can study another one, a species of Lactobacillus, and they go, oh, it's really good at, it has a calming effect because it makes GABA, which is another neurotransmitter. It's actually your primary inhibitory neurotransmitter, so it has a calming effect. And in this way, they're doing these studies where they're actually mapping out what neurotransmitters different bacteria make and different probiotics make. And likewise, they can actually give nasty, bad bacteria and watch the mice become more anxious, for example, as they get a decrease in, for example, serotonin. And then they come up with these kind of models, which is basically you take, there's in the center is our germ-free mouse. So imagine a gastrointestinal tract, a large intestine with nothing in it, no microbiome, there's no bugs, there's no microbes, no bacteria. And then they introduce probiotic bacteria. You see them get increased neuroplasticity, which is basically just improved cognitive functioning. They think better, reduction in anxiety and depression, and increased stress resilience. And the way they kind of measure this is they'll put a mouse or a rat in, for example, a little maze. And if they give it probiotic bacteria, for example, over time, they'll actually complete the maze faster than if you give, nasty pathogenic bacteria. When you give bad bacteria to some of these mice, they don't run through the maze as well. They're a lot more anxious. They don't think as well. So it's really interesting that you can see the effect on the brain and the gut-brain connection in these mice and rats. And that's kind of they're doing these huge cataloging studies where they're trying to figure out the gut-brain connection in sort of nitty-gritty detail of what neurotransmitters get made by what bacteria. Probiotics can also be useful for weight loss and obesity, and also in type 2 diabetes. So there are studies where we can lower body weight and blood glucose in diabetic patients and overweight patients. And we can also lower cholesterol and total cholesterol and LDL bad cholesterol in certain patients and patients with diabetes. And chronic infections, in particular urinary tract infections. So a lot of women do struggle with chronic urinary tract infections. So they might go on multiple courses of antibiotics. And over time, you see shifts in their microbiomes, and then they keep having, no matter what antibiotics they're kind of using, they keep having these recurrent urinary tract infections. And in particular, there's two strains of bacteria, Lactobacillus reuteri and Lactobacillus rhamnosus, that are really good for preventing chronic urinary tract infections. So they're useful here as well. And you can actually give it as a almost like a vaginal suppository of probiotics directly into the vagina, and it can really help with urinary tract infections. So overall, just to summarize what I kind of blasted through there, I kind of went through that really quickly, but these would be kind of our recommendations, and this is based on evidence. This is what the probiotic recommendations a lot of pharmacists would use as people come through a pharmacy. So just to summarize, if you had, for example, acute diarrhea or AAD, antibiotic-associated diarrhea, I would use something like an S. boulardii or Lactobacillus rhamnosus with you, probably has the most evidence. In inflammatory bowel disease, VSL number 3 is really good. For anxiety and depression, Bifidobacterium longum is, based on some of those mapping studies, probably the best serotonin producer, so it's useful for that. And Lactobacillus helveticus also has some clinical trials as well, where it can help with it, reduce people's anxiety. And in chronic urinary tract infections, like I said, the ones we use in a lot of women's health issues are Lactobacillus rhamnosus and Lacto And then for acne or atopic dermatitis and a lot of skin conditions, a high-dose multi-strain of Bifidobacterium and Lactobacillus combination has the most evidence and is the most useful. So that's probiotics. I just wanted to show you how many studies there are and how effective even just probiotics are. But it's really prebiotics that anchor everything in. So if you think of probiotics kind of as like the plants or trees in your microbiome rainforest, prebiotics are the soil. They're what actually feed everything. They have the lasting effects and actually allow everything to grow within. And you can give probiotics all you want, but as soon as you stop taking them, you'll actually see levels in stool samples start to drop if you don't anchor it in with prebiotics. That's where fibers are so important. So prebiotics, they're basically just plant fibers and compounds that help to grow healthy, that help to grow healthy probiotic bacteria. It's important to keep in mind that they don't just always selectively grow good bacteria. They can also feed, bacteria that can have produce some nasty symptoms and things like overgrowth as well. So you have to be cautious with certain fibers, not just giving them to everyone. The best source of fibers, of course, is diet. Eating a variety of fruits and vegetables and whole grains is the best way to get your fibers. But there's lots of different supplements available. You've got psyllium fiber, so that's your Metamucil. Though I don't love Metamucil because they add sugar to it a lot. So I do like just like psyllium fiber powder or psyllium husk is really good. Inulin, that's like fiberific. There's all these different oligosaccharides. So that's the ones you'll see that are like FOS or GOS or ZOS. Polyphenolics are an interesting different sort of type of prebiotic. And then there's all these others. So tannins, you find those in like wine, for example. Lignans you find in lots of different plants. And citrus pectins you find in citrus fruits. So these are basically, a lot of these are carbohydrates that are basically undigested by our gut. So they're undigestible carbs. They're not digested by our metabolism, but our gut bacteria love to eat them and metabolize them. And they produce these useful metabolites, in particular short chain fatty acids, like I mentioned before, that have lots of health benefits for us. So it's interesting because we kind of have this symbiotic relationship with these bacteria. We provide them with food and shelter, and they provide us with these metabolites that give us all kinds of health benefits. In particular, at NutriChem, we really like to use two particular fibers, polyphenolics and oligosaccharides. I don't want to get into every different type of fiber. Just know that there are very specific types of fibers that grow specific types of bacteria. So when we go back to our microbiome map, we have all of our keystone good bacteria on the left here. We know that they like, in general, to eat these different fibers. So I'm going to talk first about oligosaccharides, and fructans is just basically another word for a type of oligosaccharide. And these include your FOS, your GOS, your ZOS, and inulin, which is actually a polysaccharide, but it's in this category. I'll talk about those, and you'll see that the oligosaccharides and inulin are really good for growing almost all of these, but it's also important to note that they also grow some bad bacteria as well. So we have to use our oligosaccharides selectively, and also once someone's gut is stable, then you can use them. What we would probably use first are called the polyphenols. They're much better tolerated, and they're very selective in growing Clostridia cluster and a very ancient species of bacteria called Akkermansia. So Akkermansia, so if you look at different bacteria, so you might find in a probiotic, so if you look at like Bifidobacterium longum, very common in a probiotic, that's actually very specific to humans. And it's associated with long life. That's why it's called Bifidobacterium longum. Something like Akkermansia is a far more evolutionarily ancient bacteria. So Akkermansia really interests me because like for example, Bifidobacterium longum, yeah, like I said, you only find it in humans. Akkermansia, you find in almost any multicellular organism in nature, and it's associated. It really likes polyphenols, and it's associated with like weight loss, reduction in things like metabolic syndrome and diabetes if you can increase your Akkermansia levels. But again, you can't give Akkermansia in a probiotic. It'll die because it's exposed to oxygen. So you have to grow it with the polyphenol. So polyphenolics. These are our prebiotic compounds. You wouldn't call them exactly a fiber. They're a little bit different than that chemically, but you find them in citrus fruits, so like your oranges, your lemons, your limes, your grapefruits. You also find them in high levels in grapes and a lot of different types of berries. And like I said, they're really great for growing Clostridia clusters, and they're really good at growing Akkermansia. They're also very potent antioxidants, so some small concentration actually does get into the bloodstream, and they can have good beneficial cardiovascular effects and anti-cancer effects as well. In particular, the ones that we really like at Nutrichem are hesperidin and naringin. You get these from grapefruit peels, for example, in very high concentration. And it takes, to get an extract of 500 milligrams, which is what we would use in like our factor 4 fiber, it can take like hundreds of grapefruits worth to basically almost take these pharmaceutical doses of polyphenolics that are very good at very potently growing Clostridia clusters and Akkermansia, which are really good healthy bacteria. And this is what we would use as a starter fiber. This is what we've been using lately as our starter fiber. It's much better tolerated than some of the oligosaccharides in some patients that are very sensitive. And it's also, those Clostridia clusters and Akkermansia are really good at building the lining of the gut. So we almost have a structured approach. We build the lining on the outside of the gut first, almost like the mucus lining of the intestinal tract. And then we work our way inside once their gut is stable, and then we can start using some of these oligosaccharides. Which brings me to the oligosaccharides. So like I said, these are really fibers in the more true sense than polyphenolics. They're like undigested carbs that feed the bacteria in your gut. These grow the widest range of healthy bacteria. So if you go back to that microbiome map, they grow all of the healthy bacteria, but they'll also grow some of those bad pathogenic bacteria as well. And if you have someone that already has SIBO or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, or certain inflammatory bowel conditions or irritable bowel, or if they're sensitive to FODMAPs and on a FODMAPs diet, I would not use an oligosaccharide first, because you will kind of blow up their gut and they will hate you. Yeah, so they will get a lot of gas, a lot of bloating, a lot of discomfort, because you're not just feeding the good bacteria, you're feeding some of the bad bacteria that's actually already causing them problems. But once someone's stable, oligosaccharides are really useful. And they actually grow pretty much all 5 of the groups of healthy bacteria that I've talked about. You find them in the richest concentrations in chicory root. That's where they actually get inulin for fiberific product, is from chicory root, but there's high amounts in garlic, onions, and there's oligosaccharides in tons of vegetables. So eating a variety of vegetables really gives you these good fibers. And in supplements, like I said, it's inulin, ZOS, FOS, and GOS. Would be the supplements you look at, and we found that ZOS is probably the most potent and best tolerated because you don't have to give a huge dose. And at Nutrichem, we actually have our own ZOS available by clinician recommendation. So this isn't totally my area of expertise in terms of diet and exercise. I mean, of course, if you're going to talk about healthcare, you have to touch on diet and exercise. But the naturopaths and the holistic nutritionists really are the experts on this. But I have looked at a lot of research, and when you look at diet, it's hard to argue that a plant-based diet is really best for the microbiome because it gives you the largest variety of fibers. And when I say this, I say plant-based, not necessarily pure vegan or vegetarian, because I do still think it's important to get at least a small amount of animal protein in there. But plant-based with small amounts of lean protein would probably be an ideal microbiome diet. That's what you kind of get with like a gut makeover diet or a Whole30 diet. 90% of Canadians don't get the required daily dose of fiber in our diets. It's about 25 grams for women, 38 grams for men the last time I checked on the Health Canada website. I think most people are not even close. Whereas if you look at some of the rural populations in the world, like I said before, they can get 100 grams or more of fiber, and in particular soluble fiber. A lot of the fibers I've talked about are what are called soluble fibers, which basically means they grow healthy bacteria. So we're nowhere close to the fiber content that you'd require to have a healthy microbiome. So one great way to build your microbiome right now is to up your fiber to just the daily Health Canada recommendations. And then exercise. So there's lots of research showing that exercise improves microbiome diversity. So when you exercise, you can increase the number of strains of bacteria in your gut, and you also increase those 5 groups of bacteria that I talked about before. And there are studies showing that exercise can increase short-chain fatty acid production, which is just a marker of good bacteria. So exercise is good for the microbiome. And one thing I like to note about exercise, I love like HIIT training, like circuit training or CrossFit, that kind of thing. I think they're great. But if you're already kind of overtired or you have what's called like adrenal burnout, you can actually do more harm than good to your gut, because you can kind of put your cortisol, your stress hormone, into overdrive if you overdo it. And cortisol can actually harm the gut, which kind of brings me to my next topic, which is stress. Stress can have a big impact on the gut and the microbiome as well. I often think of cortisol as kind of the master hormone that can override other hormones. So, you have cortisol because it tries to free up metabolic resources in your body when you're stressed. If you're running, in prehistoric times, evolutionary period, early humans, hunter-gatherers, you might have to run from a saber-toothed tiger. Cortisol is one of the hormones that's involved in, mobilizing resources, because you do need that stress response, that fight or flight response for your survival. But when it becomes from a saber-toothed tiger, you're not worried about actual physical stress the same way. You're stressed at work and it becomes chronic stress. You're always kind of on this treadmill of assignments at work and you're always stressed. It can start overriding other hormones. It can reduce your testosterone in men. It can reduce estrogens and progesterone in women. So cortisol is kind of this overriding hormone that you want to reduce if you want to help heal the gut. And excess cortisol, we know, harms, for example, the lining of the gut. There's also been a lot of studies on relaxation and mindfulness techniques that have research for lowering cortisol and therefore helping with the gut. And these are things like meditation. And I think the most research is probably in transcendental meditation, TM. Yoga is great. Cognitive behavioral therapy and also certain types of belly breathing have shown to reduce cortisol, and they're good for the gut. So where's microbiome research going in the future? I don't know if any of you saw this article on CBC. I thought it was really interesting, but I think eventually we might have something like a poop pill. So it's almost like a fecal transplant where they actually take an extract from these people that have a healthy microbiome. But they take those people and they actually can put it almost into a pill form. And what they did with these, this was from University of Calgary, and this actually cured her C. difficile, this woman's C. difficile, which is a nasty infection that happens when you overuse antibiotics and totally disrupt your microbiome. They gave her these, quote, poop pills from a person with a healthy microbiome, and it ultimately cured her of this C. difficile and gave her this healthy microbiome, and it actually cured her disease. So maybe poop pills are coming in the future. It's not just poop in a capsule. They actually freeze dry it. So it's not as gross as it might sound, but you basically get a healthy microbiome bacteria from someone that is known to have a healthy microbiome. And that might be the next sort of probiotic. So I'll just run through these quickly. Nutrichem does have a variety of microbiome products. We do have our own probiotic called Nutridophilus. It's kind of the best lactobacillus strains. It's really good. I really like it when people are on antibiotics. And it's a good maintenance probiotic as well. We have all kinds of different fibers. One that I really like is called GastroGuard. It has sun fiber, which is a guargum fiber. It's usually pretty well tolerated. I didn't talk about it today, but it's really useful. We also have our factor 4 fiber, which is our polyphenolic, and we have an oligosaccharide fiber, like the ones I talked about, called ZOS. Those are available by clinician recommendation. And one of my favorites, I use this for helping people come off their proton pump inhibitor, is called GI Rescue. It's a gut healing agent based on aloe vera and some other ingredients, and it's really good for acid reflux, really good for people coming off of probiotics or antibiotics, or people with a really disrupted gut. I love GI Rescue. It really helps. And if you come into NutriChem and you talk to one of our clinicians, we might give you a form like this, or we might write out some recommendations. But basically, if we were going to treat your microbiome, you would probably leave there with dietary recommendations, a probiotic, some sort of prebiotic based on your individual needs. And then there's different gut modifiers. I didn't talk about them today, but there are herbal microbials that are almost like natural, safer antibiotics, some supplements, and maybe an exercise regimen. So that's kind of the map that you would leave with in terms of a treatment map. We would give you this kind of setup. So what would be the next steps if you're interested in mapping your microbiome? Contact the clinic at nutrichem.com or phone the clinic at 613-721-3669, and you can basically book with any of our professionals. This is where registered holistic nutritionists are amazing with, setting up dietary plans and meal plans with specifics for people for growing healthy microbiome. We also have amazing naturopathic doctors that are fully trained in all this nutritional medicine and microbiome, and even our clinical pharmacists. If you're on a lot of medications and you want to be treated for your microbiome, they might be the ones to meet with, because they can kind of orient around all the interactions with drugs and all these supplements. So yeah, you can contact us anytime. So thank you very much. I hope that was informative and interesting for all of you. And I will open it up to questions.
Okay, so thank you, Adam. That was really, really great, super informative. So I see we have quite a few questions here. So we'll just start going through them. So the first one here, looking at FODMAPs, what if you have an issue with a type of sugar and avoid those foods but they are good prebiotics? How do you balance that out?
Okay, so I have Emma here, who is a naturopathic doctor. So I'm not a super expert on the FODMAPs diet. So I don't know, Emma, what would you...
Yeah, so,
what do you think?
So FODMAPs, and I actually see a couple questions here. So
on FODMAPs?
Yeah, how does okay, so there's quite a few questions on FODMAPs. So FODMAPs, for those of you who aren't familiar, are that group of undigestibles, so the fructooligosaccharides, that sort of thing, that can cause a lot of the symptoms like gas and bloating. So some people will say they notice when they eat onions or garlic, they get really gassy, really bloated. So of course, we would never want to give these patients the FOS or the GOS or even some of the ZOS fibers. But like you said, you want to be able to make sure you're feeding your good bacteria. So normally what we do is, like Adam explained, we bring in the polyphenolics. We might need to bring in some antimicrobials. We do have to cut out FODMAPs. So we'll do usually a 3-week to 4-week diet of cutting them out, clearing out the bad bacteria that are digesting the FODMAPs, and then slowly kind of bringing them back in with tolerance. The thing with the FODMAP diet is it's very difficult to manage. I don't know if anyone out there has tried it. It's not an intuitive diet, so it's very difficult to manage, but it's very effective for kind of the chronic gas, bloating, those sensations that you're having. So one of our nutritionists is actually a FODMAP specialist, so she works a lot with guiding people through the FODMAP diet. And then what we'll do is take it out and then rebuild the gut once we've kind of cleared out the bad bacteria. So it's not, even though you can't tolerate those fibers now, it doesn't mean you won't be able to tolerate them ever. So it's kind of short-term clearing them out before you can start feeding the good bacteria with those FODMAPs.
Mm-hmm. Those are those herbal antimicrobials I was mentioning. I didn't talk a lot about them today, but they're almost like these natural antibiotics that are a lot safer, and you can use those initially to shift away from the bad bacteria. And then,
Okay, so yeah, the second question kind of around FODMAPs, University of Monash. So that's the best resource for anything FODMAP is through that university. They have a great app. So that's a really, really good one.
Okay.
Is it possible to get a copy of the slides or a list of some of the studies you referenced? So you
Sure.
will be getting the recording, and I think sometimes the slides are sent out with that. We'll have to double check with that. So please.
The recording will be posted.
Yeah.
So you'll be able to go back through, and I actually just took screenshots of the references, so they're basically referenced on the slides.
Yeah, and you'll be able to pause when you look at a recording, pause and go through it. Okay, so please expand on the relationship between bacteria in small and large intestine. I understand nutrients from food are absorbed from small intestine, and I believe that it was the small intestine that were the second brain. What is the mechanism for absorption from the large intestine?
Sorry, I'm just going to read the whole thing. Yeah, so you do have, so I focused a lot on the large intestine, but there are bacteria in the small intestine as well that are in smaller amounts where you can absorb those neurotransmitters as well. So the small intestine is involved. In terms of, yeah, so the majority of your absorption definitely does occur in the small intestine, but a lot of your neurotransmitters are made in the large intestine, and you do get some absorption there as well. Not like there's no absorption, but the small intestine has a lot, much more.
Yeah, so normally when you hear the term second brain, people are actually referring to the large intestine rather than the small intestine, even though the absorption, and that it actually kind of plays into their roles a little bit, right? Because so much of the absorption happens in the small intestine, those are where your nutrients are absorbed in the duodenum and that sort of thing. And whatever's left over, those fibers that aren't digested and aren't absorbed, that's what's actually making its way down to the large intestine to feed those bacteria.
So you do get some absorption from the large intestine. But it's just the vast majority is in the small intestine. But yeah, the second brain is the large intestine.
Perfect. And then we just got a comment about kombucha and probiotics and prebiotics. That's a great point that we brought up. Fermented foods are a really, really good source of a diverse amount of bacteria. Lots of questions.
A lot of questions about the slides. The recording will be up on the website.
Okay, another question. How do you map what a person's microbiome currently looks like? What tests do you do?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So we do organic acids, which can give us some sort of indirect markers of what's going on in the gut. So for example, like oxalic acid can be a marker of certain bad fungus in the gut. We can treat based on that. There also are microbiome stool tests. So I don't know if you've heard of like GI effects or uBiome. They're not technically Health Canada approved yet, but we have used them just to give us an idea of the different bacterial strains. So it almost lines up the different categories. So those categories of the 5 major groups of bacteria I was talking about, it almost lines them up on a scale and shows you whether you're high or low in those different areas. And then from there, let's say you're low on Akkermansia. Okay, we can't give it in a probiotic, so we're going to give you a polyphenolic. And then we can test later with something like a GI effects, and we can see if your Akkermansia has actually gone up. So there are stool tests where you can look at the levels of these bacteria out there. And we've used a couple different ones.
Yeah, so we do that often in the clinic through the naturopathic doctors or the clinical pharmacists in cases that are kind of tough and long-standing. We also have a question here. What is the difference between an RHN and a registered dietitian? My doctor would only give me a referral to a registered dietitian and not a nutritionist. Yeah, so basically, so they're different. So registered dietitian is an undergraduate program. A registered holistic nutritionist is more of a small college course, and most of the time RHNs aren't covered. RHNs, so the registered holistic nutritionists, aren't covered through insurance. But we use the RHNs just because they have a bit of a more diverse, and this is very, very generally speaking, they can be a lot more specific. So we have holistic nutritionists that specifically focus on management of the microbiome,
or FODMAPs,
FODMAPs, or management of cardiovascular through diet. Some people recommend soil-based organisms. What do you think?
Oh, what was that probiotic?
Yeah, so there's things called like Prescripticist.
Prescripticist was the soil-based probiotic.
So is the Probio 3.
Yeah.
Probiotic 3 by AOR.
Is it soil-based?
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
it has the...
So Prescripticist, I think, is probably the big one, that is soil-based for probiotic. I think it's interesting. I'd like to be able to use it, but unfortunately it doesn't have a natural product number. So we're not carrying it at Nutrichem. If they could prove their sourcing, apparently then they could get an NPN. I'd like to use it because it does give a really good big variety of bacterial strains that have some evidence for being beneficial. I like that.
There is a soil-based one, though, that we do have at Nutrichem. Again, usually we're using those more to clear out bad bacteria, and it's more an acute. So we'll dose it like a Saccharomyces. So if someone's kind of dealing with a nasty, kind of more acute thing, or long-standing infection or long-standing GI, we might bring in the soil-based and kind of do that, and then kind of going forward, we'll build up around it, but we don't maintain people on that.
Okay, maybe a couple more questions.
Yeah.
It's good having the naturopathic doctor here as well. We can kind of tag team these questions.
What would the cost be to have a personalized biomapping done? Sounds very specific and different from the lab testing. Would some sessions be covered if there's a health plan?
So you would want to contact the clinic for the pricing. And in terms of the testing, it would be a case-per-case basis. So if a patient if we really think it's best from a clinician point of view to do the stool sampling, for example, they would probably use a combination of organic acids, which gives you a lot of metabolic markers of potentially a microbiome that's been disrupted, and then maybe a stool sample as well. And that would give us an idea of the different bacterial levels. But it would depend, the pricing would really depend on how extensive your testing would go.
Yeah, so usually they range, again, first you'd have to do a consultation with one of the clinicians. Yeah. And then depending on how your case, it would have to kind of revolve around that a little bit. So usually the stool tests aren't cheap. They're usually run around $400 to $500, I believe. Mm-hmm. Okay, let's do one more. So for acne, do you use probiotics on the skin topically?
So no, we tend to use probiotics via the gut, tend to have evidence. And there are studies on using combination lactobacillus and bifidobacteria, multi-strain probiotics, and orally do have evidence for helping for acne. Again, your microbiome in your large intestine is connected to your skin, it's connected to your brain, so you do get the skin effect. You do get the skin effect via the gut. So no, we don't use them topically. I think in the future they possibly may, because I know for acne they use antibiotics topically, so maybe probiotics, I don't know if anyone's tried it yet, it's an interesting idea, but via the gut you really get the effect anyway.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of like the old school way of looking at things on the surface only, so only applying topically, yeah, that'll have an effect, but usually when the acne, you have to look at it as kind of being an expression of inflammation going on internally, and that's what's causing it. Okay, last one. Are there special probiotics and or prebiotics for type 2 diabetics?
So there's not special probiotics or prebiotics. Again, for a type 2 diabetic, probiotics and prebiotics are great, but we would probably do a whole dietary overhaul. We would probably do a whole microbiome mapping for you. So we would use certain diets, probably like a Whole30 or something like that, where we get rid of inflammatory foods, processed foods. We just put you on a diet that's essentially plant-based with some lean protein and healthy fat. We would get you on a probiotic, probably a multi-strain, lacto, bifido, 50 billion or higher. If we wanted to see results quicker, we could even use really high dose ones. There's like a company called Custom Probiotics where you can get into what we call almost a quote pharmaceutical dosing of probiotics, very high dose, and you see effects faster. And then we would probably start you, depending how sensitive your gut is, with a polyphenolic, and maybe move to something like Azalis. So no, there's not specific ones for type 2 diabetes. It would be a whole almost lifestyle overhaul that we would go through with you.
I feel bad. We keep getting more questions in, so I don't want to leave people hanging. Let's see
Do one
here.
or two more. There's so many. We'll try
There's
to
so
get
many.
to a
Okay,
few.
let's get to the kind of, a lot of them are kind of more skin specific and that sort of thing. So there's a lot kind of, that's when you do have to kind of come in, get a full assessment, look at the diet, look what's going on, look at your inflammatory levels. This is a good question to end on though. How long can you continue taking probiotics?
Yeah, so I don't know if I would use high dose probiotics for a long time. So like, above 50 billion units a day. And I wouldn't use Espoulardi long term. I would use that for an acute issue for a week or two for like diarrhea. But basically, it's safe to take 50 billion units or less of lacto and bifido indefinitely. I use maintenance probiotic. I take like the pure encapsulations, 50 billion a day. It's a mix of lacto and bifido. So no, it's safe to take probiotics, most probiotics, as long as they're not crazy high dose, indefinitely.
Well, even crazy high doses,
For
we
some
have people
people.
on, that's their, that's their, that's what they do.
Hmm. Okay.
Okay, so, and then just making sure that, because again, we didn't go through each of these questions, but if someone does want a consultation at NutriChem related to IBS, usually what the best thing to do is, I would actually suggest probably starting with one of our nutritionists, because a naturopath or the pharmacist is going to recommend diet 100% as their base treatment. And then from there, again, we'll build you up. You can be referred to another clinician if things are getting complicated and we're not getting the results kind of quick enough. So if it's really kind of an isolated digestive problem, then I would suggest going to a naturopath, the nutritionist. If there's a lot more issues going on, then I would suggest going to an ND. If you're on a lot of medications, I would definitely suggest starting with the pharmacist. So kind of starting from the bottom up. Okay, so thank you guys. We had so many questions. Thank you so much, Adam. That was a really, really good talk.
Yeah, I hope you all enjoyed it. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for all your engagement. And don't forget, you'll be getting the recording. So have a great night, everybody.